Thank you for joining the ISG Smart Talk, Network Technology Transformation, Invest or Save. Our hosts for today's talk are partner, ISG Research, Phil Hugus, Principal Consultant, ISG Research, Margot Wall, and Senior Director, Network and Software Advisory Services, Rob Long. This ISG Smart Talk is being recorded, and a link to the replay will be sent to anyone who completes the post-event survey, which you'll be directed to at the close of this webinar. Feel free to submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the Ask a Question box on the left side of your window. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, or if you're listening to a recording of this broadcast, we'll answer your questions in a follow-up email. With that, I will hand things off to Phil to kick off today's ISG Smart Talk.
Great. Thank you, Jillian. Good afternoon to all of our friends on the call in Europe today, and good morning to those folks in the States. We're very pleased to have Rob and Margot along for this discussion on network technology transformation. As you all know, we're at a very unique time in the technology marketplace as it relates to our enterprise clients and how they're viewing this technology transformation with their networks. Everything as a service, enterprise clients pivoting digitally with their client experiences. The network has come screaming back up the stack after many years of being commoditized, and conversely, enterprise clients are trying to figure out what strategies they should employ to take advantage of technology transformation. And our provider community is doing the same, from the tried and true global carrier set that has been managing enterprise client transport for decades and decades to new competitors, both from a managed services perspective or an integration perspective, as well as those folks that are looking to try to capitalize on last mile strategies for enterprise clients. It's a very exciting time in the marketplace for those of us that have been around for a while. It's the fourth or fifth opportunity in the last 30 years for enterprise clients to take advantage of technology transformation and all that it may bring to benefit their digital pivot in their businesses. There are many points of view. There are minimal standards so far set out for concepts like SD-WAN and NFV and 5G and other kinds of things. Clients are struggling for repeatable solutions. Providers are struggling to provide those repeatable solutions, as we see from our sourcing engagements in the network side. As a matter of fact, I spent the better part of last week in Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress, and it was amazing to see over 1,500 different providers of different sizes talking about SD-WAN and talking about NFV and 5G and technology transformation, all with a different perspective on how it's going to impact their businesses and those of our clients. Given ISG as a leading sourcing advisor is in the middle of this on a daily basis, we felt it appropriate to bring this webinar forward, and very much excited to have Rob and Margot, two of our deepest subject matter experts, on the call. So let's move on. We'll say hello to Rob and Margot. Rob, Senior Director in our network organization, responsible specifically for transformation, has a broad and deep background in network sourcing and transformation. Margot Wall is our principal consultant from our carrier advisory practice, responsible for all the research we do into the carrier set. And Rob and Margot are going to be leading us through much of the conversation today. The agenda looks like this. We'll talk a little bit about trends in network technology and sourcing trends. We'll talk about the skills shortage, positives and negatives in what we're hearing. What's the secret sauce that helps a provider win an engagement? And then we'll take some questions at the end as we wrap up our hour together. So very much looking forward to the discussion and looking forward to your questions, and we're really pleased to have several people with us today. I'm going to shift it over to Rob. So Rob, if you want to pick it up here and take us away with SD-WAN.
Great, thanks Phil, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. So we'll jump right into SD-WAN, a hotly covered topic for the past few years, actually. And looking back on 2018, we definitely saw for the first half of the year probably a lot of inhibitors on a wide scale. Not really any different from 16 or 17 when this was really starting to just get introduced to the enterprise market. Those inhibitors were things like, what is the real value, right? Is there risk? Should we be an early adopter? Are we early adopters? Who else is doing this? And there's a big, I think, kind of gap between what I'll call the large enterprise space and mid-markets, even up into the smaller end of the enterprise segment with, companies or global enterprises in the, 15 to 100 location range. They all behave a little bit different. But again, all inhibitors that we saw in the beginning of 18. Moving into the second half of 18, I would say that the provider community has done a good job, approaching contacts and generating more awareness around offers that are starting to begin to mature and gain in terms of deployment overall. So creating a little bit more of comfort of what's possible that's out there, to the point where planning efforts have begun, smaller proof of concepts, or even in kind of the agile terminology, experiments have started with many of our customers across the globe, looking to flesh out what's going to work best for them, starting on a smaller scale, maybe those small remote offices, and then kind of look upwards into the enterprise and see what's going to be most effective on a global basis. And I think the biggest realization overall is this notion of investment, which in the network world, being in the provider community many years ago, and I know a lot of you probably feel this, that it's typically been a kind of a cost out segment, and under most CIOs and CFOs, the network historically has been looked at a place to continue to save. And given that we're at a point of a huge pivot in the network world, and it's nowhere near like moving from frame relay to MPLS was, things are far too different and vary so widely, it's just not that simple. And this notion of investment has certainly surfaced. So in order to advance and realize all the benefits that are being promised with respect to simplified operating models, the ability to leverage multiple medium types and not actively participate anymore in that passive network or active backup configuration, has piqued a lot of interest. And of course, all of this coming on the heels of the infrastructure world, right, where virtualization and shedding assets, no longer owning data centers, right? So this is the next step everybody's looking at to become a more effective part of that value stream of, more quickly operationalizing workloads and changing them accordingly if a new service becomes available. Last, and I think of equal note here is, those physical and financial barriers still certainly exist to go out and change all of the edge devices in a network is substantial. And depending on the asset lifecycle that's in place, it could delay, the decision-making cycle for, a certain period of time. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. A little bit more on SD-WAN in particular. So I would say that most discussions are pretty well pointed. That the CapEx model is still heavily utilized, so that is one of those limitations in terms of going through an edge refresh. Some of the OEMs out there have made acquisitions strategically, as you're pretty well aware of, and depending on what I'll call the box at the edge or the router that sits there, it may be as easy as enabling some software or upgrading a version of code to open up capabilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But it still kind of leads to a vendor lock-in approach, which I think a lot of senior IT executives are starting to become very wary of, and much more open to, spreading around services to a multitude of providers and looking at more of a best-of-breed type of approach, more than they ever have. It certainly wasn't uncommon in the network space to standardize on a platform and have limited risk, but as things are fast, changing and very dynamic, we're going to definitely see that continue. From an edge perspective, the virtual CPE component here, whether that's network function virtualization, or bringing something along the lines of security into the mix from a new architecture, it's still a little bit difficult for a lot of the folks to kind of conceptualize. So they still view everything as being very edge-centric. The edge will still need to be touched more than likely for a transformation. And how is SD-WAN in particular going to lower network costs? I think everybody's been whispering, or there's a multitude of websites that have been created where you could plug in various attributes of your network, scope, scale, size, average bandwidth, et cetera, and wow, it's a 60 or 80% savings. Why not go forward and take on this transformation right now? And the devil's certainly in the details, but I think that's contributed to a lot of the resistance and why it's taking so long to kind of take up this new technology in the larger enterprise space. From a cost out perspective, it's one of those additional promises that we have with SDN and NFV in terms of simplified operations and an easier platform to manage, which should ultimately result in less folks having to touch and less manpower, elongating change cycles, reducing risk as well. In any event, that's kind of, I think, the framework that our enterprise clients are looking at. So those CapEx models, very edge-heavy, edge-centric, and then also, you got to throw into the mix that, why can't it just be network as a service? And I'll touch on this later, but this concept or notion of network as a service is somewhat confusing. It's not really standardized yet. But as I mentioned before, when it comes to platforms and infrastructure and data centers even, there's certainly been a very large movement to cloud-based services over the last decade. And that kind of trend or that desire to continue to not own things being core to the business are certainly highly desired. So the simple question often asked is, well, why can't we just do this with the network? And I'll touch on that in a bit, and I'm sure you all have been asked that many, many times as well. Another point is general geographic dispersion, right? So touching, again, edge devices that are spread across the globe is not easy. And just deploying even a new device that touts itself as being, call it, zero-touch provisioning or deployment, we're still seeing those in the hours ranges, 3 to 5 from a cutover perspective. So this concept of plug and play, zero-touch deployment, we're all kind of, giving each other high fives for turning over a 1,000-site network in under, 15 days. It's just unrealistic, just given the complexities that exist in a lot of these environments. Another point of noting is, and this is mentioned quite widely in the provider community, especially the folks that are on this call when, we facilitate various meetings or strategy sessions with you all and our joint clients, that the maturity from knowing what you have and where you have it is still quite low in the enterprise space when it comes to network equipment. So for those of you that have gone in and done a walk-in and type of takeover or transition managed services, and you run a discovery and sometimes hundreds, even thousands. I know of a few instances that exceeded 10,000 devices. So those things kind of don't sit real well when it comes to let's just go out and change the way we're networking today. That's a big hurdle, and one of those things that's being worked on in the back end, I think, in terms of competing priorities and getting their environment ready for the next level of change. Again, CapEx, depreciation cycle, sweating out assets, right, based on investments made in the last few years is a difficult topic, or it's very difficult to make a new case to go in and change yet again. Some OEMs, as I mentioned before, have made some strategic acquisitions to simplify this. Regardless, I think this will be another issue for some period of time to get out of that, refresh cycle where assets that were purchased 2 years ago are no longer usable, or where do they fit into the new, the new architecture. Moving on to the, the WAN component here, kind of call it the edge transport a little bit more specifically. there's a lot of discussion on MPLS and, is the internet going to be the dominant transport medium eventually? Will MPLS fully disappear? We don't think so. We think that this is really an underpinning and part of the value prop, and certainly these comments were echoed in all of 2018 in terms of adoption and, practically or pragmatically rather, going through an adoption of a new technology. If MPLS exists and it's working well, how do you complement that medium? Potentially removing a backup circuit that's in place, inserting broadband from a least cost per megabit perspective. But now with new technology, being able to fully, share those services is one of those value propositions, I believe, from an SD-WAN, platform, right? That's what I want to be able to use. I want to simplify my engineering and routing and take full advantage of everything I'm buying. I don't want to have latent capacity. It doesn't make sense. It's not often used unless there's a failure, so I should be able to do that. However, in the broader context, this is somewhat, highly debated because we don't really have a lot of data on this yet. Will MPLS disappear? I don't know. I mean, our advice is typically step into the environment and you can optimize over time. So don't base your entire business case on fully moving to a broadband-based or internet-based model when you've historically relied on MPLS, and depending on your service set and all the real-time media that's floating around your environment, which you likely don't have a good handle on, again, from a client perspective, I think that's a bit risky. So over time, there's certainly room for optimization, but we'd counsel kind of to limit risk as much as possible and maybe begin to wind down bandwidth on the MPLS side, but you really can't do that optimization without data. The good news, though, is obviously most of the new platforms, as well as a lot of the provider services you offer from a reporting perspective, provide much more visibility than we've ever seen in the past. So again, in short, we don't see MPLS, disappearing here completely or falling by the wayside. We see it being as a complementary medium to other internet, whether dedicated or shared mediums, potentially, 5G once that rolls out, but I think we're a ways off from that being a local loop type of alternative. In any event, it's going to be some time to tell on that. I think in the near term, most enterprises will adopt the hybrid approach and utilize multiple mediums to their advantage. Certainly not, I can't go on without saying that we haven't seen all ends of the spectrum in somewhat of a limited fashion. I mean, moving to fully, a full internet deployment over MPLS has certainly happened, and depending on the business type, whether it's retail, financial services, healthcare, that may or may not work. So we definitely, caution and provide counsel that, risk needs to be cared for accordingly in those environments. More often than not, those configurations are, based on less sensitive traffic. So what can we move to the internet first? And this isn't so much about SD-WAN. This has been going on for years in creating local internet breakout to kind of enhance end user experiences as clients have moved a fair amount of their services to cloud-based platforms outside of their own data centers. In any event, there's certainly some risk there, and it's going to take some time, again, to optimize and see, what the user experience is really like and what's going to perform best for that particular enterprise and their fingerprint, if you will. In terms of the session initiation protocol or SIP deployments on voice or contact center, as well as real-time media, right? So video continues to grow, I think, at our younger levels of the workforce, right? The iGens, millennials, et cetera. And there's a lot of caution for enterprises out there still on, my real-time media. I can't sacrifice that and just kind of hope for the best that my SD-WAN appliance is going to care for, full packet duplication and the fact that my end users will not suffer. I think that's a pretty big deal. But again, it goes back to the unique enterprise. So really listening to your clients, understanding what they're doing, what's top on their agendas. You're certainly going to hear enhanced user experience an awful lot, and that's, I believe, going to be one of those other items, kind of holding on to MPLS because we know it's a certainty before we could see how the traffic behaves over other types of links, internet, more specifically shared internet and broadband. And I think at the kind of the end of this, or the closing statement on MPLS, is around those very large enterprise networks that are out there, financial markets in particular, financial services, that is. Not sure if they'll ever leave MPLS behind, just due to the nature of their business. And a lot of those folks have evolved their networks to a point where they've opted for more in-house than to be out-tasked or outsourced specifically. So I think all these kind of contribute to MPLS being around for some time. Moving on to hybrid WAN. Again, this is one of those points when we're brought in to talk about technology in the network space with our clients. I hit this one pretty heavy. I like the hybrid WAN approach overall. I think this approach is somewhat of a menu option that enables or unlocks, if you will, SD-WAN and value, from a client perspective, because medium types can be used more readily than ever. However, this concept of, adopting certain services early on that were not quite SD-WAN, so not to call out any particular platforms particularly here, a lot of these that went in were basically just VPNs, right? And a VPN doesn't really serve anybody very well as traffic continues to hairpin or trombone through data centers or even through cloud providers for that matter. The point of the hybrid WAN is to be able to fully leverage different medium types. So moving fully to, mostly broadband with a little bit of MPLS, I still think that case hasn't been made. So that savings angle that we continue to hear about, or that's on those websites that I mentioned before, kind of evaluate your network and look at that 40, 50 to 80% savings and move now or be left behind, is certainly something that really needs to be considered with, what is the end user impact? Okay. When it comes to the management aspects of SD-WAN, again, it's about simplification, but it's really a re-architecture. So it's a very holistic discussion. You can't leave security out of this discussion until you're about to deploy. You need them along for the ride in terms of experiments or your trial or proof of concept, whatever that might be. It's really important to bring them along, and requirements drive different things. And in the case of cost, requirements change and security postures may stiffen over time, and things like deep packet inspection or decryption, as an example, are going to carry significant loads on the network from a way traffic needs to flow, either through premise-based equipment still and appliances or virtual CPE, as well as cloud-based services. And that cost burden could be quite substantial. So those early discussions, making sure that all the stakeholders are part of that discussion is really paramount, so that the business case is right-sized, it's fit for purpose, it's not overbuilt, that the security folks and all IT leadership understands, what does the new architecture offer, what services and what capabilities will it bring, and then what requirements must be supported to protect the enterprise. Twofold, from an end user experience perspective, so good quality of service, as well as protecting the brand and the image of the enterprise, so that it's locked down to the extent that as much as they can without, paying potentially unnecessarily for additional capabilities or services, again, that are often thrown in at the last minute. Last point here to touch on is really, these theoretical, limits, as I've already mentioned a few times. Moving to, broadband more often than not, 56% savings. We had one engagement in 2018, And really, this enterprise really hung on this, and they wanted their business case, to really hinge on that type of movement. I still think there's a lot of risk out there. I think from a provider perspective, you guys should be as transparent as possible, and caution on that type of change, right? Take advantage of SD-WAN's benefits, fully utilize SDN in your networks, as well as the platforms that are chosen. Really, really important. So the other last bullet here, I think, is really important. So not so much of a jab here, but really just, I think, feedback. Broadband is certainly growing. It's part of the menu for services, and I'll touch on that layering approach here in a minute. But there are aggregation strategies. I think enterprises still want to deal with the limited number of suppliers as much as possible. And you really need to determine whether you're putting your best foot forward when you put something like this on the table. And this is in terms of a broadband aggregation and resell opportunity for you. There's a demand out there in the market. Clients, again, want less providers to deal with, but they want a broader portfolio of services. And if this isn't very well baked, it's not well thought out, and you can't operationalize it, this is something that's going to impact your relationship more than likely. And you're trying to be customer focused here, but you're not quite ready for it. So definitely think twice before you introduce something to solve for a problem that you might not be equipped, to do. Okay, moving on to network as a service. So I kind of lost count in 2018 how many conversations I had with senior IT leaders on network as a service, and where do we even start with this? So I think that there's been a lot of focus, again, based on the maturity of IT environments and moving from legacy enterprise or client-owned data centers to buying software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and winding down data centers using public facilities instead, as well as shared services. And now that same group of leadership wants to overlay that into the network world. So it's becoming quite confusing with those that don't or haven't grown up with a lot of network experience, and they want to shed all assets and buy network as a service. So I typically start that conversation out with let's level set on definitions. What does network as a service mean to you? And after a few jokes and kind of talking through the various nuances of the enterprise and what it could mean for them, I fall back on my experience in this industry, which I'm sure is shared by many of you on this call. I think network as a service was probably born a long time ago with the advent of universal service ordering codes and the long list of those that would compile a single service for use. It was inherently transparent. If you wanted something, it was added. It wasn't necessarily bundled, but it was billed on a monthly basis or as a service. Clients don't want that level of optionality anymore. They certainly want it to be simple. And I'd argue that network's always been as a service. However, the big change here is where we move into the enterprise. I would say at the most drastic point of this, it has to encompass the LAN as well from a managed service perspective. End-to-end visibility. There are a lot of assets out there, tens of thousands of devices that don't just kind of get removed immediately or taken over. But again, going back to senior leadership discussions and a strong desire to not own things anymore, which is contrary to kind of historical network environment that's been heavily based off of capital, expenditures. So it's an interesting discussion. We're not standardized on it. I think everybody has in their own mind what this means to them or what it could mean. So that's a huge limitation for us right now, and a lack of understanding. And I think it's all further complicated by all of the various options that are out there. It's not as simple as picking, an SD-WAN platform. What about the security aspects or complementary cloud-based services for, proxy or load balancing or whatever it might be? And it's a dramatic shift in the architecture that needs to be looked at, from a holistic perspective, looking at the enterprise from large sites to very small remotes, and ensuring that it's fit for purpose, and then what can be packaged up from a service perspective. And again, this is going to be unique on a per client basis, I believe, for the near term and potentially the long term, just based on the varying degree of options out there, both from a transport perspective, broadband, MPLS, et cetera, as well as the hardware appliance, and then bundling services into edge devices. Again, things that historically haven't been done before, very different, widely varying. It's going to be very difficult to standardize on this. Interesting discussions nonetheless, but still trending somewhat. Clients want it to be as simple as possible, and that's what we hear time and time again. Looking back at 2018, so we really found two primary trends, I think you could say. First being the really lengthy or overly long evaluation cycles that were going on, and again, it's due to all of the options that exist and the amount of time it takes to bring everybody together to create a holistic architecture that really changes the way the network is operated. And then the second would be decoupling the network architectures in terms of building out that menu of services to include more options, from an enablement standpoint. So, most of these client engagements that, ISG has from a transformation perspective, are really twofold, right? One part would be assessing technology, and the second would be, relooking at transport from a negotiation standpoint. Entire network migrations are something we don't see. It's more on a service-by-service basis, or carving a particular component out, or even looking at it at a region. And I'll touch on this in more detail in a minute. The operating model is shifting, right? So this concept of decoupling, network architecture from standardization standpoint on various transport types, right? And bringing the management layer above, certainly emerging and I think becoming somewhat of a dominant theme as we move into 2019. Regardless of all the aforementioned, the cycle of changing in the network world is very difficult, right? So geographic dispersion, asset, life cycle that's out there, can something be repurposed or not? All of these seem to still be around an 18-month cycle, potentially longer, depending on the client situation. But from, I think, our feedback to the provider community, these aren't short-term type of investments on the client side. As much as I think there's a desire to accelerate and change faster, we're still finding it quite difficult to see anybody that can compress that 18-month cycle and realize much value. Okay, so I mentioned this briefly before, and this is really with respect to kind of really a theme and an approach to network services. So the single approach from a management overlay perspective, so whether this is done internally or through an outsourcer, this is what we're seeing in terms of overall traction, right? So a single management overlay for all network services. Now, there's always going to be outliers here. As an example, the local area network may reside with an infrastructure provider and they're doing a great job from an outsourcing perspective. However, we see over time this kind of bundling or packaging from a management overlay perspective continuing to grow, and all these services coming back into the view of the management entity, typically on the provider side, or even in an outsourcing arrangement. And that's due really predominantly to end-to-end visibility. So when you speak to IT leadership, CIOs, senior executives, they talk a lot about end user experience and visibility, and it really just isn't WAN edge to WAN edge. Those aren't statistics they're very much interested in, because it doesn't give them a full kind of picture when they have a problem, when there's an executive leadership call or a town hall and they can't use real-time media, or they're having bridging issues, whatever that might be. If there isn't a real quick way to dissect that problem or even predict that it's going to happen, more importantly, that's something that all needs to be solved for from a transformation perspective. So again, this management overlay concept is going to continue to grow. I think it's a great opportunity for the providers in terms of coming into an account representing a true end-to-end solution, not the historic end-to-end, the local loop is ours, we're going to move faster on your behalf because the network's ours, but really the value on the management side is being able to add value as an extension of the client team from a wireless LAN perspective, which is really any device, anywhere, any type of connectivity. That's a predominant theme in the enterprise world. Most of the workforce is mobile. They're not sitting at a single desk or a single office locale. So again, that management overlay continues to be, I think, important, and this trend is going to continue to grow, and a really good opportunity from a provider perspective to expand your management capabilities. Now, the difference here predominantly on transport, or what we call the transport underlay, is that opening up that menu, right? So how do we adopt SD-WAN? What does it mean for us? Well, we need diversity, we need high availability, we're architecting for those types of things, and we need a broader menu. And that's more than likely going to include some regional providers, potentially a national or a domestic provider, a global or multiple global providers, even providers that offer different types of services, going back to broadband, whether that's through aggregation and resell, or whatever that might be. That menu needs to be there so that SD-WAN can be fully leveraged. A site that has multiple connectivity types over diverse mediums inherently will be more available and over time can be optimized, right, for an enhanced end user experience at the lowest cost possible from a per megabit perspective. So again, this is really this decoupled concept we talk about. I think it's a good chart or graphical, depiction of it. But trending-wise, we're going to see more of these services holistically brought in, a good opportunity for the provider community, certainly, and certainly a value prop potential so that you can really underscore the benefits of SD-WAN and push back further into the local area network as well and deliver capabilities that just don't exist today. Okay. I'm going to turn it over for, I think, the balance of our deck here to my colleague Margot. She's going to start off with the skill shortage, which goes into play really and touch upon most of the things that I just touched on, given we have changes upon us and things are drastically different. So I think it's a good segue. So Margot, do you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Rob. In 2018, ISG did an extensive research regarding the labor force and what the field experience looks like. We did over 100 interviews, and we talked to service providers, we talked to recruiters, we talked to enterprises, ISG advisors, and even the U.S. Department of Labor. And so what we found here is that we are definitely in a skills shortage that we've identified, and how we're going to talk to you a little bit about how that skills shortage can actually be used to your advantage when you're talking to your enterprise clients. So what's happening is that there's going to be a hiring war between service providers and enterprises. And when we went through our surveys for our Provider Lens team in the Quadrant Report, 15 to 20% of them noted a hiring war and noted that skilled technical applicants, when they show up, they've got 5 job offers in their pocket, and they're asking us to beat any of these job offers if we want to hire them. So not only are there fewer skilled applicants, but they're going to become more expensive, and the GSMA is actually talking openly about a skills gap. So how is that going to affect your enterprise? What's going on in the labor market right now is that in the telecom industry, 40% of the labor force are made up of baby boomers who are beginning their exit out of the workforce. They are a very different mentality when it comes to how they look at their job. They're very much a cradle to grave. They take pride in having long-term job histories with different service providers. So what are service providers doing? Well, they're having to significantly invest in training. So not only are they having to pay more for trained people, but they're also having to take people who have an aptitude for technical and train them. And we believe that this is going to become worse before it gets better, and that it's going to become a global issue. The group coming into the workforce has a very different mentality. If they have technical skills, they want to get promoted really quickly. They don't have that cradle to grave mentality in any way. They want to go work for companies that are going to really move the needle. So Google-esque types of companies, the companies that have come onto the market and changed through technology the way we live and breathe. They want to work for those companies. And they're either going to get promoted from within, or they're going to move around to get those promotions. And what happens is when they get to the CIO level, they don't want to take the time to put together a 5-year plan to get their network transformed, because reality is, that's what you have to put in place if you want to address all of the media. You have to start with, an assessment, as Rob talked about. Even having the conversation is an 18-month cycle. So what we believe is that the folks that are the very technically savvy millennials, they're going to gravitate towards technology companies. They want to be part of the core business. So they're not going to work for an automotive company. They're going to work for, Lyft or Google or Amazon or Facebook or somebody like that. They don't want to be overhead. So where this benefits you as a service provider is that you want to start thinking about having conversations with your enterprises that convince them that they really need to be not thinking about doing their DIY attempt. They're going to find that they're going to have there's too many choices, there's too many options. It's very difficult to do the assessment, and they're going to have a difficult time finding the right people to run their network because of that skill shortage. The other area that we learned the most in is how the account teams on the ground behave has the biggest impact on how a client decides to move forward in their network arena. They will consistently renew with client teams that they view as positive, and they will consistently take to market with client teams that they don't believe are positive. So the language that we hear is very consistent throughout enterprises. And we'll hear it about it's not consistent with service providers. It really comes down to the team. So in one project, we'll hear complaints that ABC network is a very positive experience and XYZ network is a very negative experience. Go to the next client project and you'll hear exactly the opposite, and they use the same words over and over and over again. The very top of the list is responsiveness. And that translates to you taking the next necessary steps to resolve issues, get requests made, stay in the email thread, don't just hand it off, and get things resolved as quickly as you can. And if you can't, manage your client's expectations so that they're not just left having made a request 2 weeks ago and they didn't hear back from you. Credibility is another word we hear a lot. You have to say what you're going to do and then do what you said you were going to do. It's really that simple. If you are in a quoting situation, if you are putting a proposal together, stay in process. Don't go out and put together a proposal that is going to get resolved by a concession at the end of the process. Or when your contract comes out of your system, it doesn't match what you promised. Those are very critical things that can really upset a client and upset a process as you're going through a sourcing activity. But look at your day-to-day work and your communications. Are you clear? Are you correct? Do you have typos all over the place? If it's a very critical communication, let somebody on your team take a look at it. Being respectful is very important. Even if you believe that you are the smartest person in the room, try not to act that way. Be respectful of your own team members. Let them participate in the process. And, communicate in a way that is respectful to the client. So not shouting. I mean, we've heard about shouting matches. You wouldn't think that they would happen, but they do. And then flexibility. So are you willing to go outside of the box or outside of your comfort level? And what I mean by that is I talked earlier about don't go outside the process when it comes to pricing and proposals and contracts. But in terms of going outside of the box and offering up innovative solutions, what we hear more than anything is that a lot of the account teams that are involved with are involved in our client projects, they don't feel comfortable talking about SD-WAN solutions. They don't feel comfortable talking about NFVs. They don't feel comfortable talking about the network in a new transformative way. And so clients are saying they're not bringing anything innovative to the table for us. If you're not comfortable, you might, consider getting some practice. Consider bringing your experts in whenever you can. I'm sure all of you do, but think about it more often when it comes to SD-WAN. Nope, sorry. Then we hear the opposite. When a client is coming to us saying, I want a divorce from my service provider, we get exactly the opposite words as we got when they're willing to stay. Arrogance is probably the word we hear the most, and it can be the most detrimental theme if you're winning or losing an opportunity. So always consider that you want to take that down a notch. And if you're not bringing innovation into the client, then you really don't have a lot of nothing to be arrogant about if you're not bringing new ideas to the table. The opposite of responsive, don't let your emails go unanswered. Don't let your deadlines get missed without acknowledging them. Be communicative, stay in the email thread, and make sure that your issues get tracked through to completion. Because if you don't have an opportunity to sell into a fertile environment. If you don't do what you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do it, you come across as untrustworthy. Your proposal needs to match your contract, and your pricing needs to match what you proposed. If your billing is incorrect and your project change requests are exorbitant after you've won an award, then that's going to come across as being taken advantage of and not being trustworthy. Obviously, that's not what the contract says is not the right thing to say to a customer. But don't be afraid to admit that you're wrong. The customer should be the person that's always right. Even when they're not right, you have an opportunity to be gracious. And if you're out of your comfort zone with something, then get some help internally, but don't push back and be defensive because it's something that you're not really comfortable handling. Then we get asked this. What really makes up an award? What really is the secret sauce that wins a deal? And the recipe is a little bit different depending on the client, but it usually involves these four areas. The first, as we talked about, is your behavior. ISG has always had the perspective that all things being equal, the account team's behavior has the biggest impact on the client's award decision. So make sure your house is clean. Don't let issues go unresolved. That's what forces your client to go to market, and that's what inhibits you from coming in and trying to sell them even the next most innovative solution is going to go flat if there's issues that are left unresolved. So you need to make sure you're clean there. Bringing forward the best pricing, the best contract terms, and being aligned with the client's direction, that's just what it takes to get a seat at the table. You've got to go an additional step of the way. And we see that come in a lot of different areas. We see that, adding something else into a solution, combining two different types of products where it's more than the sum of the parts. Does that change your pricing methodology so that you can offer them a lower pricing methodology? If you combine a build-out with conferencing, for example, does it change how their conferencing is metered? If you're simply going and doing a presentation and you put a matrix up that says, look, we can reach more of your sites than anybody else, if you take the time to do it, the client will notice, and we've seen a couple of those. Where the client was very impressed because they took the extra effort to align on the sites and put up a map. The other area is if you believe that you are going to be able to save them money, and not necessarily specifically off of your invoice, but in their overall structure, make sure you demonstrate it on paper. You can talk about it all day long, but if they have a presentation in front of them, if they have a document in front of them that says, if you do this, you will save this, then they don't have any choice. They have to take it through their due diligence process. They have to take it through their finance organization. And we've seen it over and over again where the client's thinking, well, we're just going to go and renegotiate our current contracts, and they open it up to someone who is not an incumbent, and that incumbent comes in and can demonstrate something that is beyond the scope of what the requirements were, and we've seen them make awards in those directions and take it away from their incumbent, who is probably somewhat complacent. And as always, be asking yourself, why should the customer buy from me? Because that customer is always asking, why should they buy from me? And this is really not the corporate Kool-Aid part of it. It's not your marketing group. It's what you demonstrate on the ground, and it's what you can do to align with the client's objectives. We get a couple of different questions, and I'm going to hurry along here because I'm looking at the time. We get these two questions the most. So this is the invest versus save question. They want to understand how SD-WAN is going to save money and how and when. And what's happened is that in their rush to drive very fast bandwidth, which was because of their internal digitalization infrastructure, all of a sudden everything became online, and they now were crying for bandwidth. They tended to shift to a homegrown hybrid WAN, as Rob talked about, and that was a big part of their savings. Right? The whole point of the advertisement and promise of SD-WAN was you can save 40%. Well, how do I do that? It's because you're going to use a lower cost technology for transport when and how your network is able to shift that application. So the orchestration part of it is part of the promise. But what we're seeing is that service providers are not really being transparent about how, now if the customer has done this big hybrid WAN and has a big cost out, where is there going to be additional cost out? It really is going to come from them. It's going to come from them eliminating the complex edge devices and maintenance costs, and it's going to come from redeploying of resources. And it's also going to make an impact on whether or not they actually have the kinds of resources that can actually run an SD-WAN network. And this is where you're going to continue to say, let the experts do this, offload this, and focus on your core business. But redeployment of resources is a big factor here. So you also need to be making sure you're having a conversation at the right level, not at the level of the resources that are going to get deployed. The opposite of that is, if I'm going to invest, when am I going to get an ROI? Well, there is no when there. It's really about, can you help them develop a total cost of ownership model? Can you help them shift to an OpEx model? Because it's a big shift for a lot of clients, both a financial and a cultural shift. Can you take over some of their existing equipment? And can you help them understand how that skill shortage is going to work against them if they're trying to do a DIY model themselves? So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Jillian, for questions.
All right, thanks, Margot. Thank you. We do have several audience questions. We'll get to as many as we can. The first one here is for Rob. Given SD-WAN is all about the software, can you talk about changing provider and in particular new providers in the market / what is the threat and opportunity for the legacy telco provider?
Okay, thanks, Jillian. So there's a couple things going on with this question, but really, I think at the heart of it is solution centric. So clients have always liked options. So the more that you could present in terms of a benefit, strengths and weaknesses based on multiple options, I think is really important. I think ultimately, the threat there is if you're kind of single hitched to a platform or something even that potentially is proprietary, you're more than likely going to exclude yourself from a lot of competitive events. So optionality, I think, is really, really key there, and that could lend to being a strength.
All right, thank you.
Oh, hey,
Next
Rob,
step.
it's Phil. Hey, Jillian, it's Phil. Sorry, I just wanted to add something to that.
Yep, go ahead.
It's a great question. Rob took a bit of a technical swing. Since I think the things that the providers often forget is deal fatigue, relationship fatigue, with the technology changes that are about to occur in the process of incurring. That technology change is going to require, the old ins and outs situation. There's a lot of embedded relationships that can be made at risk just by the client thinking they have an opportunity to look at something different. In the sales enablement elements of our research, we've trained over 2,000 sales reps in our pursuit optimization classes. And one of the things we talk about is how do you stay away from relationship fatigue? How do you keep it fresh? How do you, sometimes you got to cannibalize your own deal. And a lot of what we see from deal fatigue is just that. We're worried about selling circuits and adding revenue, but we're not doing all the things that make a client appreciate us. Then you get to that right moment in a renewal, and you suddenly find that the client suddenly has a lot of different things that they feel are wrong, and a lot of it ties back to deal fatigue. So there's still a bit of salesmanship in our world today that you have to pay attention to.
All right, thanks, Phil. Next question we have is, what is your perspective on the zero-touch approach that many OEMs are marketing?
So it's Rob, Jillian again, and I'll kind of take this one. It's a great concept. I think it probably should be rephrased as near zero touch. It's a great thing that it's going to take some time to mature and get to that point. I'm unaware of many success stories here. At the end of the day, our perspective is run it through the lab as much as you can, spend more time in due diligence. It's going to make the rollout go a lot easier. We've been engaged in far too many instances where the planning phase and testing was somewhat expedited out of what you call urgency or eagerness to move forward, and that deflated the value prop and really led to a longer deployment cycle than was ever anticipated at the beginning. So spend the time up front, do the due diligence. It's okay to say we haven't done this before, or we're still figuring out ourselves, and we want to work with you to make sure that it's right for your environment. I think that'd be the best approach there.
Hey, Rob, Phil again. One more thing to add, again, more sales oriented. We hear all the time about how many tens of thousands of user locations or client points that are under contract working with the service. And, when we peel the onion back, it's all held together with 10 miles of duct tape and a lot of airplane glue. So the concept of repeatable solutions in the world that we're in today, just quite frankly, it's still at its infancy. There's a lot of individual things happening out there that are very cool for specific clients done by a specific provider with a very unique set of circumstances, and that's great. That's what's going to, ultimately end up in the continual evolution of the solution set here. But, please do yourself a favor and not drink too much of your own Kool-Aid when you're having these conversations, especially if the engagement's advised, because the advisor will peel it apart in no time. And we see all of the big providers, see the little guys. We see just how sparse repeatable solutions are in the market, short of individual situations where someone has done something Herculean. So do yourself a favor again. Don't oversell your skis, if you will.
Yeah, Phil, just one last comment on that. Openness, transparency, it's all about customer focus. Do the right thing, and collectively, across the broader provider community, that's going to be, I believe, an enabler to help adoption, increase or accelerate. There's certainly going to be some more toe stubbing, but don't oversell it, and be as transparent as you can about the limitations or the things that need to be done in order for you to have mutual success.
All right, thank you both. I think we have time for one more question if we move quickly, and that is, do you foresee successful 5G evolution will replace the wireless APs in the enterprise network?
That's kind of a tough one. I mean, that's like picking my own lottery numbers, I guess. I think 5G is going to have a place, from a wireless LAN perspective. Timetable on that really can't predict at this point. It's an incredible set of capabilities. Going back to that, type of I need to connect anywhere at any time, and the network is truly just invisible to me as an end user. I think 5G is going to go a long way, but in terms of wide-scale deployment and kind of the challenges in the large enterprise space with global dispersion and a multitude of various, facility types where things like this haven't been encountered before, like wireless LAN has tackled over the last decade. Hard to tell, but I like the concept, and it's certainly something often asked about is, will this, should I wait on my refresh at this point? I think it's a little early to go to that extreme.
All right, thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone. This does conclude our time today. Thank you for joining this ISG Smart Talk. As mentioned, we'll be sending the replay to anyone who completes the post-event survey, which you'll be redirected to at the close of this webinar. If you would like to speak with Phil, Margot, Rob, or any of our ISG advisors, please reach out to us at www.isg-one.com. Thanks very much for listening.